Everybody's here?
Yeah. But I don't want any extra exposure. No, I'm strong.
Thank you all for coming tonight again. I'm going to speak very little tonight. For the most part, I'll probably be more like you. I'll be in the category of asking questions to understand more and to try to help delve into some of the nuances of what we've been talking about by using imagery. Tonight, Doug Young is going to do most of this presentation, which we're excited about. And it's a presentation that's a combination of materials that he and Caleb and myself and Lisa have all reviewed and Amir reviewed. Some of the imagery you're going to see in here is imagery that is also tied to the survey that you're going to be doing here shortly. So we want to let you know that you're kind of looking at that. So we're talking about firsthand things that are also going to be images in the survey. For the first one would be residential images. The second would be industrial images for those properties that are industrial. And the third one would be contemporary images that are really used kind of as for the homes that you're allowed to build a contemporary home there, not ones that are not historic by nature. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back, and we looked at it before, but we didn't unfortunately display it correctly, but we talked about I'd asked Doug to help produce a parameter spreadsheet to help you understand what you absolutely can and can't do kind of at the city level. This is their threshold of what you can and can't do. So he's going to talk about that. We haven't had time, and it's happening so fast to edit it all, but we can talk about it. And the point of it is to get that to move from can be to it is. So that's what you're ultimately making decisions about, is what is, not what can be. And then Lisa produced cliff notes. They like the proposed, that's item 5 and item 6, like the first draft of the proposed regulations are not reviewed yet from the city. So they're not approved, but they're indicative of what you should expect. And so when you look at it, I'm sure there's errors and mistakes in there of different kind. They're not intentional, but they're just there. Those will all be flushed out over the next few days. But just to let you know that Cliff Notes version that she's creating, we call it Cliff Notes. I think it came up with another name, Intraday. I'm not sure what the final version of it was, draft regulation, something to that effect. And at any rate, if you look at that, that also is a living document that should change over time, and the purpose of that is to give you a shorter, smaller document to review. And then we'll go back to the planning timeline, which is say, hey, here's where we are now. What should we expect over the next coming weeks? And with that, I'm going to now hand this off to Doug Young to handle the first part of this review, which is compatibility for residential.
Great. Good evening, everybody. Once again, my name is Doug Young. I'm with the City of Orlando's Planning Department. I work in the Office of Design, and I manage the city's historic preservation programs. So thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's not a great night to be out and about, but we do certainly appreciate it. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the ideas of things being compatible or compatibility, or how alterations and additions might be considered when you're looking at them in real life images. These are images from both the neighborhood and then relatively close by. To sort of walk you through some of what our thoughts would be on these kind of scenarios, and also point out where things have been done with these projects that might be positives and some things we might thought could have been done better on those. So you really get a sense of real world examples of the things we keep talking about in the words and so on and so forth. So we thought this would be pretty useful. And this is something that, if you think about the idea of retaining the historic look and feel of a neighborhood, this is where the sort of rubber meets the road, which is how do you actually see that and conceptualize that in an actual project that someone has done. In this case, these are already finished projects, because that's why we took the pictures. So they're in no particular order, but we want to sort of try to cover them and make sure we can keep going on the rest of the agenda. So let's see how it works here. All right. So what we've done is we have an image, and then in the little bubble there we have sort of it's a little blurry, but up top the things that we think are good about that proposed, or in this case that project. Then sometimes a little note in the lower left-hand corner, like this one talks about the second story addition. And Amir, can we get a little let's see. I can do that. I can't. Let's see if we can get
Projector.
It's the projector.
Yeah.
It's not the computer.
Well, it's also not full screen.
Yeah, I can do full screen, I know that.
Oh, there you go.
But the, oh, there we go, yeah.
Is it in focus
Magic.
now? I can't see, so somebody, oh, sorry, sorry Bob. Somebody has to tell me when it's in focus back there, because I can't see it. Is that better?
That's good. So real quick, so we had a house, looks like at some point it was the one-story house, that's probably where the brick portion comes from. Then a second story was added to it. There's some positive things about this proposal, in that the roof pitch, the brackets, which are the things underneath the eaves, some of the architectural detailing picks up on what was part of the original house. One thing that's kind of awkward about this, which is just as a thing to point out, is you'll notice on the right-hand side, facing the image, the new wall sort of sets in from the old wall, which is actually not very common because it's a big construction issue when you do that. I'm not quite sure how they made that work for this situation, but normally the walls would line up, and that actually works out. It helps a lot of other things about how parties would sort of fit in. Again, I don't know what happened with this as far as the construction technology with it, but anyways. So, but it has, that brick and siding combination isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's actually handled in this sort of a manner. And I would note that there could be other things that have changed on this house. We're just sort of trying to hit some of the big picture kind of things to give a sense of comparison. Here's another house. In this case, you probably had a sort of a one-story bungalow, maybe a Queen Anne cottage kind of effect. And the addition in this is that they moved that roof up, that gable, that triangle-shaped roof up, and then they added stuff behind it. So on the side of the house, you can see that white band. It goes front to back. That would have been the original location, the original eave line where the roof would have come down. So they've sort of added something behind that sort of original form to this house. But the window pattern in the front, the porch columns, the porch as an overall thing is still there, and then that roof form, because it's pushing back, still gets that big facing front roof plane, that big gable that is what you would have seen before in some way. The other interesting about this is that this sits up on a hill, which is of course not unusual in itself, but it also means that when you view the house from the street as you're walking or driving by, this addition is sort of recedes more than if you were at sort of street level with that addition. It's sort of up behind the house up on that hill. The one thing I noticed they also, as part of the renovation probably, is they made the driveway into ribbon strips versus a full concrete width there.
In this parking in the front, which we were doing.
There's a driveway in the front, but you couldn't have an extra wide driveway normally.
That little pad was the parking.
Oh, that pad, yes.
Yeah.
We would not normally, in most of our district, we wouldn't normally support that.
It was key through land use lines.
Yeah. And they also did things, it looks like they replaced the windows, for example, which is not intended to slide, but just to acknowledge that as something that occurred. There's another house. So again, it's actually sort of the same kind of house, if you can sort of remove the second story there for a minute. But so again, you have a brick house, brick clad house on the bottom. The window and door pattern on the bottom appears to be original still, how they're arranged on the house, the windows and doors. Then you have a second story addition. The one thing that's a little bit awkward about this situation, even though there are some compatible things that fit in, is that it's a relatively complicated roof form. And it's sort of like, sort of roofs on roofs. And if you can think about that in comparison, if I don't, y'all can have that in your head for just a second. Then you go back to this house. While this is a bigger sort of volume, maybe, it's less complicated than that. So that's something, when you look at having the addition be, we might consider to be secondary, or trying to make it not the most prominent thing on the house. This is one way you do that, by having a simple form that doesn't sort of draw your attention to that upper story. And then, as the black note says, the eave line is original with that white band around just below the eave is all part of the original house, of course. The porch is all the same, except for probably being painted, maybe something like that. So that's another kind of example. This is not too different than the other one. In fact, we might have added this note about the addition is too complex to the one before as well. But here's the situation. These are all essentially the same houses on the original part. This had its porch enclosed at one point, but it's a 2/3 width porch. It's a brick bungalow, had probably 6 and 12 sort of relatively average roof slope, if you will. And the one thing that's interesting about this is they added that, but you can tell it sort of sits even a little bit up than those other additions we saw. So just a little too, stuff on top, a little too much height and volume. And then it has, the extra dormers on the sides. So you get, again, this idea of the complexity, maybe gets a little tricky. And so it tends to, in some ways, overshadow the original house it's on top of.
Are you saying this is good or bad, or giving a value judgment?
Some of them are good, some of this is good. Our comment here was about the roof and then the sort of overall weight of that size of that addition. It's the way it's hard to tell from the outside, but I suspect they had to do something with the floor because it sort of sits above where the ceiling would have been on that original house below. So sort of some extra distance that might be inside that. And maybe some of the windows have been replaced at some point along the way as well. It's hard to tell from this distance.
Did it look like that the second story addition, that would be like the 10 feet that was being referenced in the...
Yeah, so that's a good, let me see if you can get a sense. So that's another thing, comparing this one to this one, is even though there's some concerns maybe about the size of the addition sitting on top, it is farther back. And it's a little bit hard to tell, but this is a very simple A-frame roof, what we call a gable roof. And so you can go sort of measure straight back, and that'll give you a distance. If we're looking at setting back additions, this is the easiest way to figure on this kind of house out. So it is set back from that main wall of the house, which is usually positive.
I was just more about the depth.
Oh.
10 feet sounded like a lot to me.
Yeah,
I can't quite tell.
if you were to look at this a little bit, and it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can see on the left side when you're looking down the driveway, you can see barely 2 window openings on the house. All right, so the best thing to look for is just where it's not brick, so you can see those 2 openings. So if you think about this house from this era, it's probably from the 20s. You probably have a dining room on one side, a living room on the other. Those rooms are typically in increments of 4, so it's probably a 14-foot deep front room or 12-foot deep front room. So if you use the windows, you can see that addition is about probably at a 10-foot, maybe an 8-foot distance. Of course, if you were looking at a project, you'd actually be able to measure a proposal, but you can sort of ballpark it looking at the architecture as well. So that gives you a sense of the proportionality, because many room sizes, just like today, are sort of increments of something. They're always sort of some common sort of distance, mostly because of the structure of the homes. You only have your wood go so far before it starts to sag or whatever.
So Doug, just a clarification for me, because I don't know anything about this. So the porch, even though it's enclosed, doesn't count?
The way the current draft is, it talks about the front wall of the house, regardless of the porch being enclosed or not.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and the reason why that's something that we think is a relatively good idea and it's worked well in other places is because that porch still has the sense of being out from the house. Even though it's been enclosed, it still has the porch sort of form. So you still want to have get that tiered effect by getting that farther back, that potential addition. And that's an actual question that comes up a lot when this is a point of conversation. And here's another example. This is all probably the same kind of house. You got a 2/3 width front porch, as it covers 2/3 of the front of the house. And in this case, they probably raised the pitch of this roof. It probably would have been a lower, slope, lower triangle. But again, because it incorporates that second story in a collection of gables that are, while there's more than one of them, they are actually pretty orderly, and they sort of, are relatively subtle for a second story addition in that way. The one thing that's kind of interesting about this kind of proposal, which is not related to the proposal for the historic, just when you're reading a home, you can often look at the chimneys, because my quick glance at this shows me the chimney was not extended necessarily, which means that there might have been a taller roof to start with, but they don't know for sure. But the chimneys usually have to clear the roof by a certain distance for safety reasons, and so that's one little sort of clue you can want to look for if you're curious about what's happening with homes when you're driving around or looking around the city.
Yeah, it seems like this one has the second story addition in the plane of the house.
Yes. Yeah, so,
So we have an either-or situation.
well, if using the parlance and the terminology we've sort of laid out as an idea for you all to consider about the second-story additions versus dormer and gable additions, we had a fourth one you might remember, which is in the proposal now, and would show up in our summary sheet that Lisa did, which is the roof plane extension, which is you take the roof and push it up in the same plane. So that could have been the case here, for example. And then also these, you could argue that this would not be considered a full second-story addition because it's within a roof form, as in the new roof sits on the bottom, the top of the old house, the original house. So if you compare that to this has those vertical walls and the roof on top of that. So that's like a floor plus roof structure on it. But this is sort of floor space in the roof structure.
So in the one previous, you could extend the gable of the front of the house and increase some space on the right side.
I'm not, say that one more time, I'm not quite following you.
In this particular
Yeah.
example, the second gable back, which is the front
Yeah.
face of the, you could extend that up and create some additional space over here, as long as it's under a gable roof.
You could, in this situation, if you sort of were to take out what had been done already, you'd have to probably do a little more work to that roof because it'd get the head height in it. So you might have to do some kind of a dormer thing going on there. Yeah, you could. The roof plane extension where you sort of push that roof up as going away from you works better when the roof is the other direction, but you can sort of do stuff like that here. It's a little more tricky, but it works better when you have a house, which I don't know if we have an example here that maybe coming up.
I've got one later.
Okay.
It looks like there's a second peak
You're talking about, is it the right one? Okay.
behind the chimney peak.
Yeah.
Is that right? Like they did an addition behind that original?
Yeah, so that,
peak
I
of
mean,
the
you know,
house?
it looks like, yeah, there's definitely more floor space back there within those sort of gables. They have not quite what we call nested gables, but they're sort of just like a pair, but not really quite a pair either because they cut each other off a little bit if you're,
Yeah.
you know, look at that. So this is kind of a little tricky house because you're not quite sure because of that chimney thing I mentioned, what might have really been going on there, but they definitely tried to keep that roof sort of more subtle than maybe the previous example. And you might get almost the same amount of square footage, for example. Telling you exactly what's inside and the stairs and so on and so forth. Here's an example. This does have that side-to-side roof, you know, where the triangle's on the end. And this is a little bit of what we call Tudor or English vernacular. And that little peaked roof here, the little arched window, the grouped windows. I suspect this little stoop on the front is probably redone or maybe recreated, but nonetheless, it's a pretty common house type, particularly in Northeast Atlanta, and then obviously exists in your own neighborhood. But the key thing about this is that because of their roof setup, you can see the addition is just in the back there on the left. And this is an example where they essentially might have created what amounts to a really big dormer on the back, although it won't sort of read like that. It goes all the way across the back probably, but it doesn't create its own roof form that's bigger than the main roof form. So, and it also is sided, which is okay when you do additions, particularly on brick homes, because you really can't match the brick, plus you don't really want to match the brick of other things that come into consideration. This is also probably an example where they might have finished the downstairs too. You never know for sure without going in there, but you know, it has enough windows, and they have daylight, which is always, of course, important in living space.
Question, would that be a place where they could use stucco for the siding?
You could, yeah. Usually that what comes, in our experience, that comes down to some weight issues sometimes, depending on where you're sort of supporting all that. But stucco, if you can do it on a pretty much of wood frame, which is how it's almost always done in Atlanta. So you're really building much of the same structure, you're just putting something different on the outside. But you could have done stucco, yeah.
Would they let you do like some of these houses where they've done this sort of like it's like a hardy plank, but it's flat and they kind of create
A panel.
effect. Yeah, like
Yeah.
would you be allowed to do that?
Yeah, we haven't had folks propose that in the district we work with now, but cementous siding, which is what a hardy product is, we don't use product names in our descriptions.
Right.
But yeah, people use non-wood siding on their additions pretty routinely in other kind of products.
As it's worded right now, is that an acceptable material to use?
I think the way that is described that way, if I'm not mistaken. Cementitious siding is the,
Siding.
yeah. Like I said, we don't use product names in the city regulations, but.
I think we should discuss that now.
Okay.
You mentioned that you wouldn't want to match the brick for the addition, why is that?
Well, two things. One of the principles that actually is really embodied in the proposal that you're all considering now is that you want additions often to be just to have some differentiation from the original house, so that if someone were to have done this, particularly if they took out the eave line there, and they did it really, really well, it'd be hard to tell 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what was the addition and what was not.
So which one would
Because one of the things about the historic district is to make sure the historic buildings get their due, and then you don't get confused about what's actually historic in the neighborhood.
A little bit.
This case you would not, but we do have circumstances where folks have done additions that you actually would not be able to tell from the future. Yeah, it's pretty unusual, but
Especially
Change of
the
material.
older brick, unless you're salvaging it from a project, like if someone's tearing down a building, that's really one of the other places you can find it.
yeah.
And it's usually really tough to find.
The other thing that we've had, which is not related to the issue of how it fits in, but just the practicality, is that it goes back to the issue of the weight. If depending how your wall is built, it can be kind of tricky too. But I mean, it's possible. But most people, they're just looking at logistics and expense, and so siding or stucco are perfectly fine options usually.
And in this example, that addition that's towards the back, that's, I mean, you're getting a glimpse of it, but that's considered a rear addition, correct?
This would probably be considered some sort of a roof addition. The rear additions normally would go to the ground, and they actually have more footprint.
But from the standpoint of
This is-
compatibility zone, that it's past the compatibility
It
zone,
could very well could be in this scenario.
would this be considered visible from the right of way?
This would be considered visible from the right of way.
Is that
Because
just
of
because
this
you're seeing
visible.
it down the driveway?
Yeah. Which is why the question of, which is one of the points of conversation, if I'm not mistaken, is how do you figure out what's in the scope of the review? And so while visible from the street, which is the term we've often used, seems like it's like, oh yeah, that would make sense, yeah, this is what it is, but it does lead to more conversation than if we just decided some sort of a zone or some distance. So that's one of the sort of trade-offs, potential trade-offs. Yeah. So
What
this-
about like on that one, do you think that they closed in any part of a porch, Doug, and like in terms of windows and porches? Is there any element of that to talk about?
Yeah, so it can be a little tricky because it would, I mean, probably the very original configuration of this house was open, but it's also common for these to have been enclosed pretty early on in their existence. And it's, there are some things about that to make it seem like it's a little extra nice enclosure, so maybe it's a re-enclosure of it from before. It's not kind of like a true porch like you'd see in the other houses we've seen.
Right.
And this house would have not had the stoop over that little roof over what was the door. There probably was not a roof over the rest of those stairs in that sort of terrace.
Is that
I
considered a
suspect
chimney?
that
I'm sorry?
Is that considered a chimney?
What's in the top there?
Yeah.
That is a chimney.
Okay,
Yeah.
does that meet the criteria for standing out from the chimney as far as?
Look, well, yeah, it's hard to tell from this picture because it's from what's right around it. So if it's far enough back and far enough tall from what's around it, it might be good.
Okay,
Yeah. It's vertical and horizontal clearance normally.
okay.
if this was the original chimney and the original roof line, it's likely that does not meet current code.
Yeah,
Okay.
But unless you touch it,
yeah,
you don't have to change it.
good point.
And if that was a front porch that was enclosed, when you are measuring the 10 feet back or whatever it becomes determined, would that be from that face or would it be from the face of the kind of the main floor?
Yeah, so it's sort of the question we talked about before. So the way it's currently proposed for your consideration is it's from the wall, the main wall of the house.
That bump out would not,
That's right.
And these would have been cold burn.
Yeah.
This is very much of a morning side.
Yeah, these are much more common in Morningside, Lennox Park. They're all everywhere in that
There's
area.
a corner.
They're all over the place.
It's right on the park, I've been in that house.
I don't know where our notes went on this one. Hold on. Let's see. All right, well, we'll just, so let's see, we got these two, let's sort of talk about this one. This is another revival style, you know, and I think what we're trying to get at here is these are a little tricky because this house could have had that shed, really big dormer in the front, but it's really just, if you think about the way the walls are stuff, that's really just a really second story that went straight up and they made it look like it's part of the roof. That could have been very much original to this house. That would be unusual for that to be the case on this style of house. What's a little kind of weird is that to the left, you see there's a little bit of a roof sort of perched on that side roof, and I'm not quite sure what's up with that. But yeah, this is an example where if this had not had this on it, you could make an argument because of the way this is set up that kind of a dormer could fit in with that style house because of the fact that they are pretty common otherwise. A sided house over sided house, it's always had just the stoop. There's never been a regular porch on this house like you think about for a bungalow or something like that. But the little roof over the door, just that little bit of foot or two would have been probably original feature as well of the house. It has a lot of great features, and most people don't think of this as being a house, an in-town neighborhood house, but they're actually not that unusual in other neighborhoods for sure. Morningside, I think, another example, which is a little bit later in time than most houses in Ponce Island.
So if it didn't have, if the original house didn't have that upper level, just roof, you just saw the roof there, and somebody wanted to put an addition, it would need to go further back based on what we're saying, and it would have to go more toward the back than stand in front there.
Yeah, so great question. So the way it's currently proposed now is if this had been a addition that had true vertical walls to it, like one of the earlier versions where they just put a new top on the house, that would have to be set farther back. But this would be considered, the way we conceptualize this, a dormer addition to this house.
Okay. Is that because the eaves are maintained? You're basically trying to avoid having a two-story face?
That's part of it, and also the fact that this roof has a shed-style roof, which is
So anything coming out of that is...
yeah. So
okay.
in our view, just in the way we've interpreted this in other districts, is that this is appears to be, although on the right side it might get a little crazy because you can't sell some trees, but it sort of sits on the roof plane, which is sort of taking over that roof plane. While it's a really big addition, or dormer addition, it still visually is sort of sitting on the roof versus sort of taking over the roof.
Does this have two different roof materials on it, slate and something else?
It might.
Yeah.
So,
Architectural and that you're at a lower elevation because no one actually sees those top shingles from the street. They're cheaper.
and if that were the case, then you would have more markets say this had been added probably, and they salvaged the rest of the slate or took it all off and just put back the pieces that weren't broken for the bottom. That's possible too. There's a question.
Well, actually,
Sure.
can you explain just again so everybody's really clear that it's this true second story addition that has to be set back, but the dormer additions or gable additions don't have to be set back?
Yeah, so what Lisa's talking about, and just bear with me, we'll go back quickly if you can find. So this would be, the way we described it so far, is a true second story addition because it has vertical walls that are essentially regular wall height, give or take. And that would be a second story addition. And those, as currently proposed, would be set back versus this could be, you could probably argue, is a gable or dormer addition. This is in the back anyway, so we already built in some flexibility for that. This would be a dormer addition. You could argue that you're getting close to not being quite a dormer, but I think you're still there. Yeah, that's all I was going to say about this one. So this is another house, sort of like the brick ones we saw earlier, a little bit wider for whatever reason, big a lot maybe. I suspect that this is both, you can see the second story addition in the back, sort of off to the right there with the lights on the window. That you probably had some sort of gable thing going on with the porch having its gable and the main house having its own gable. It's a little bit tricky because the roof that's in front of that little section of shingles there, looks a little awkward to me, but
It's a red barn.
I understand, but I'm just saying that 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 amount of distance, it's not quite just an eave detail, it's not quite just a gable return, it's actually a little section of roof, but and then they have the second, what I would consider to be a second story, because it has those true vertical walls that are generally wall height, plus the roof on top of that.
So, but it's set back from the front, does it have to be set back from the sidewall as well?
No, well, that's currently a proposal, and that goes back to the issue of constructability, because it's pretty tough to, and it actually creates a very awkward visual
Yeah.
relationship.
Complicates things.
And there's ways on the side to, and this is, if you look at what's currently on the table for discussion now, is that the second story additions still have some issues of compatibility because we want to make sure that you can tell there's a little bit of second story addition. So on the side, you can do things like maintain a piece of trim that would break the first story from the second story. This is a sided addition, or maybe looks like it's probably stucco panels, so that might help us out anyways. But if it had been sided, you would say, well, let's keep that, sort of that marker of what was the original Mayan house, which isn't particularly hard to do, but most people, you might not think about that when you're designing the detailing of the architecture.
So that is part of this, because I was confused when I went through the code, whether you could just do band board separation, or you had to extend the whole overhang.
So the current, if I'm not mistaken, the current second story addition, like section, I guess, of the code that's proposed, talks about retaining the eave lines, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that is kind of in the weeds, but something to think about. And you know, we've been successful in having sort of both be done. The eave is the more obvious way to do it, and it's sort of maybe simpler for folks to understand. But you can't do it other ways.
Yeah, this is,
Yeah, this would be sort of an example of that.
So it would allow you to take that band, and once you get to that 10-foot point, you could tie it back in and just use a band as opposed to the roof line.
You could, yeah. I mean, you can get it to, it can be equally as successful, let's put it that
It
way.
would be acceptable as a,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's about it on this one.
especially the change of materials.
Yeah, change of materials, which we don't really get into too much in the proposal, but that in and of itself helps, because when you change the materials, you have to have a transition piece there, or a transition element, because you can't have the two materials marry otherwise, just for waterproofing and stuff.
That looks like stucco on there too.
It's a stucco panel, or maybe true stucco. It's hard to tell from this distance, but
In the front, is that what you're
in the
saying?
front, and then the front of the second story addition looks like a little stucco section there too. A little hard to tell, but yeah,
That's quite typical.
Yeah.
Stucco panels.
yeah.
Right. Original.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing that's interesting about this house too, that is not what we put up here for, just as to make a note of it, is that this house probably has a crawl space in it, but you can't really see that really well because the porch itself only is one step up. So it sort of makes it look like it's a slab on grade, but it still probably has a crawl space just past that, I would suspect. So this was a couple things we use this as an example. We mentioned the chimney here, which is kind of an odd thing to note, but this is probably a little bit too far forward if you were to use this sort of talking point about some distance being set back, whatever that distance is, we're not to that point yet. But the one reason why we talked about this, which is kind of a sort of wrinkle, if you will, is that let's say this had been set back more, it would also have given the chimney more sort of space to be on the house. I know this is really subtle architectural kind of thing, but right now it sort of looked like it's sort of squished in there. And it's probably, it might have been the original chimney, although it seems it's extra tall in this kind of house, but who knows. So it's like, well, maybe in this case, if you would have gotten more of that, what we think is some distance back to make it work well for the addition, the chimney would also benefit from that visually as well. You know, I don't know why this was done this way. Of course, we didn't review this house, but you know, maybe they didn't want to mess with the chimney. Maybe the brick was something that they didn't want to get involved with. But so that's sort of
Well, I
a.
agree with you. It looks like it's been extended,
Oh, okay.
but not enough.
Not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
it doesn't look right being level with the roof.
Yeah. I mean, assuming the original roof that's on just above the brick is the original shape, you would think it would normally have been lower.
Right.
It doesn't need to be that tall historically, or even today for that matter. So I don't know what they were trying to do with getting it sort of partway up there or not, but.
I mean, wouldn't that have been considered just incompatible in general, just the way that the form meets that original roof? I mean, that's
Yeah, so, I
really
mean, the
awkward.
real issue that the addition is sort of really cuts off that front roof and is.
There's more problems.
Probably not the 10 feet and all that stuff, so it just, the chimney is a sort of byproduct of how that makes it more obvious, I guess, is the way to think about it.
May I ask if squish is a codifiable word?
If it's capitalized, it is.
Is it,
Does it, in other words, move? Here,
the slope of that addition doesn't seem to match the slope of the rest of the house. Is it just?
Well, it's kind of a little bit tricky. Just sort of ballparking it real quick, the roofs that have the hip roof, where you have more than one roof plane that come together, those just look like they're pretty close to each other. There might be a little bit of difference. In the hip, when it recedes away, makes it look shallower than it really is. So I suspect that this first slope roof is probably the same pitch as this gable roof, but it looks like it might be less because it's falling away from you visually. Which is one of the things that kind of gets tricky when you look as a general concept, when you look at a drawing of a house, how you'd actually experience it in the real world is not how it would show up on the drawing, because it's a two-dimensional thing versus a three-dimensional space. So we often have the situation when we look at plans in other districts where it looks like, oh my gosh, this is going to be like way out of scale or whatever. But if you really think about, which is why it's important to have accurate drawings, what actually is going to happen, it'll end up being fine. But if you looked at it without sort of understanding that, you'd say, oh my gosh, this doesn't fit.
this may be out of place, but the second story on the side is way out of scale proportionally to the
Yeah.
lower half. The
Yeah.
lower part of the building, which is the original,
Yeah, so it's almost like that second story
is too high.
is more floor to ceiling height than the downstairs. And if I'm not mistaken, in the second story addition proposal now, it talks about that floor to ceiling height, essentially, we describe it another way, it would have to be equal to or less than what's currently there now.
Right.
And we call it, it's the plate to plate height is how we describe it, but
If you wanted to,
Relationship with windows.
yeah, it messes a lot of things up.
if you wanted to raise your first story, your ground story roof level, can you do that? Like say, oh, I want 10 feet on the top, so I'm gonna make my bottom story 10 feet too?
I guess you could.
I've seen some examples where
We've seen it too.
they raise the roof, you know?
Our next door neighbor did that,
Yeah.
but what, there's a little bit of a screw up in proportion between the windows, it's first and second floor.
Yeah, they didn't
Because of
put new
that.
windows and that kind of like.
No, that was not the issue, just the distance between the top of the lower window and the ceiling of the other. You could see it's like 1 foot more, and it just,
Yeah.
it was a little.
Could you make it look compatible?
Good. But you had to have a skill on it.
One thing I'll say, just for folks, we could have talked about this earlier, but is keep in mind on this house, any of these houses we've seen that are brick with this band around the top. If you can sort of think of this house as not having an addition, but that band is sort of like the brim of the hat, if you will. And so that's, while it seems like it's sort of a relatively insignificant piece, it's really important to make all this fit together architecturally, because this band, which actually is two pieces of wood that have been put on top of each other, is sort of gives you that visual indication of where the structure starts to begin behind it. And that, as you look down the side of the house, where the driveway is, the ceiling of that house is at the top of that band into the interior. So if you were to pull that out, it would probably match up at the top of that band. And that's where you get to the question about proportionality and how this is extra tall because it sort of uses that sort of distance to its advantage, I guess is one way to think about that. And that also allows you for the brick to stop when you're building the house, and because behind that band is not extra brick, it's just framing. So the brick stops at the bottom of that band.
And the band overlaps the one.
Yeah, and then you put some flashing, and it has all these functions that are really helpful.
Now, are we able to, or do these regulations permit things like out of scale and those kinds of things, or is this gonna be acceptable?
Well, the way we've tried to respond to that is this idea of the potential floor height of the second story addition.
That's about as much.
Floor to ceiling, I think, as I said, I think we said plate to plate. The
Yeah,
plate is
plate height.
the plate is the top of the wall, construction-wise, the next top of the wall, because that's what you call it. It's called the plate when you build that.
You always start though from the main level, not from the basement though, right?
Yes, I believe it refers to the first floor or the main floor.
So
That's a
the
good point,
basement could
though.
actually have a lower height level.
It could, and that, many of them, of course, have head height that you can use for all sorts of things, as long as it's otherwise meets the requirement, whatever the use requirements might be. And then, in this house, the regional windows seem to be all in the sort of general place. So here's some examples that we thought were more obvious and things that might be problematic. So here's one example.
Wow.
And one thing to keep in mind is there's all sorts of things going on with this house, but I'll point out a couple things that are a little more subtle, which is not want to put this photograph up here, but just so you can sort of see with the eye that we don't want to see it. So you can also see that there's a little glass block that's been used on the side, and of course there's the stuff on the roof as well. There's something going on in the back, which might just be a deck, but that's really not usually a big issue. But the big thing is, of course, the rooftop addition. So a couple things going on. Of course, it's not set back. It is probably taller than the first floor of the house, thing that we've just been talking about as far as the floor-to-floor height. And
Roof just not finished on that, or is
I think it's just a reflection. It's an all glass addition. It
that's
appears
what
to
I
be.
expected to be.
I call this modern chaos.
Is
But
it actually
it
in there?
hasn't.
Yes,
Yeah.
those are all somewhere. The one thing I'll say about this house that's really kind of interesting is that you could have done a pretty sizable addition to this house with just a little different approach and got much the same volume except for this little thing on the left side. But with dormers, because this is a really good house to add to because it has that steep pitch already. It has the head height in the attic. You just need to work with that to make it come out better, hopefully.
Doug, is this currently allowed in any areas in Quonset Island, like if someone wanted to do this tomorrow?
I mean, just before this conversation, assuming it meets the height, which is a 35-foot distance, which is hard to tell, but it's probably right in that range. You could,
It's under 35.
yeah. So you could do that today, assuming it meets the building code, which is pretty straightforward. Yeah. Here's another great. This is also sort of the English vernacular Tudor-esque style house. Mostly because of the really big prominent chimney, which is usually not on the front except if you have an English vernacular house. The steep gable, it's another common giveaway. That alternative materials, we got two different kinds of masonry working together, that's also a common feature. But in the archways, all that, we've sort of talked about that. So they did an addition. We're not quite sure what's happening in the back, because we just see from the front, but it isn't a roof plane extension because it doesn't extend the roof. It sort of cuts it off and adds this sort of set of windows there. And it's not a gable addition because it doesn't have a gable shape. And it's not really a dormer either, so it's sort of a second story, sort of rooftop kind of thing going on. Yeah, and it's a clear story window, yeah. So, again though, you can see that on the left side of this house, the end where the roof is, there's a window there, which, presuming that's the same size windows down below, which is probably not unusual, you probably have the head height to do something in the attic if you went back versus going up and back. And that, like the house we saw earlier, the white one where it had the sided addition on the just you could barely see, essentially the same kind of thing. Because this is a gable roof, and there's probably another roof that goes back that covers the rest of the house, a different shape. Here's another house. You got a couple things going on here apart from the bad flashing around the dormers, but we'll leave that for another day. You can see all the water accumulating on the shingles and stuff. But again, it's not a roof line extension because it goes straight up. It's not a gable or dormer. It's sort of this in-between kind of thing. It's not a true second story addition, and it's not set back in that effect. While this kind of a house, which has a little bit of a English vernacular sort of thing going on because of the little door there, just barely. You could actually argue that dormers would work on this house, but these dormers are too skinny.
Yeah.
Like it's just the window with a little bit of wood on each side so you can frame it in. And so that's something to think about. The other thing that I would venture to say is that if you can follow along here, on the right side, there's the roof that's kind of a little shorter. That probably meant that's probably was a porch at one point. And this is a really common, I suspect this is maybe a 30s or 40s, 1930s or 40s house, maybe just after the war, maybe, you know, right in that time period. And so this is a house that almost uniformly had a sized porch on it. It was off the living room. You know, they probably also changed their chimney, it looks like, in some way. But so there's a lot of things going on here with this. And then, of course, they changed all the windows. Looks like all the windows. I don't know if there's anything that's from the beginning. And so those are probably the original openings. And so this goes back to one of the conversations we've had here, which is being able to replace windows, but try to make them at least fit in with that style if you keep the opening the same, which is important, more important even on the brick house than inside of the house for sort of obvious reasons about the brick being manipulated, that kind of thing.
In the current regs,
Proposed regs.
Or, sorry, the proposed regs, the current version, current draft, I know you can replace it and you want to maintain the same configuration, but I thought that at a previous meeting there had been mention of allowing to go with a historically appropriate divided light, even if it wasn't the same as what had been there.
Yeah, I think so. I know there was a provision where if it wasn't clear what was on the house, because sometimes all the windows have been replaced.
Right.
So there's a way to sort of try to find the best solution, if you will. I can't remember about what you were mentioning just offhand, but that's.
I feel like in here it didn't
Okay.
sound like it, but like if there were, well, I guess most of them would have been divided light. So if it was a divided light, 3x2 or something like that, and you wanted to do just the verticals, and there was historic precedent and it was compatible, would it be allowable to make that type of change if you in fact knew that that wasn't what had been there?
Yeah. So that could be the case, and because we're doing some new approaches as part of retaining that historic character. So in our other districts, we'd say we need to match something. So the question, which is I think still on the table, which is what do you do about windows that none of these are original? We know that. So what are the best replacement for them? If you even want to replace them, you could keep them as long as you wanted. For example, you don't have to replace them. If you did, what's the appropriate solution? And so one way to think about it is that the pattern, which is how they're arranged on the house, is equally as important as what's in the hole, so to speak. So that's an argument for having something that might be with this sort of time period of house, but it might not be what the exact minimum might have been on the house before. Yeah.
It seems to me that to address that sort of thing, I think the reducing of the lights within the opening in some way is important. Whether it is historically accurate and correct, I think is up for serious debate, in my view. Because you could argue that just dividing up the glass in some pattern would be a nice thing there, because that solid panel of glass is not in keeping with anything.
Yeah.
But I think we should give the option for people to choose how they divide the glass.
Okay.
As long as it's divided with true light or simulated light,
Yeah.
changing materials for steel window, for instance. Those kinds of things are equally as good to me.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Yep.
Doug, could they have done, if they had done the extended roof line,
Yeah.
so you lose the windows on the front side,
Yep.
unless they put dormers,
Yeah.
but they would have been able to accomplish as much height and floor space as they needed with that, right? And it would have looked.
Yeah, probably. It's hard to tell because you can't see the back of how far
How far back
whatever
it
this
goes.
thing is goes. But I suspect, given the way the house is set up, this is a gable we see, we're just seeing one half of that gable. That probably spans maybe 24, maybe 30 feet from front to back. Just again, talking about how houses were built. So then you probably, if there was more to the house, there would have been another roof form that would have covered that. If there was like a leg that had been built or something like that, it would have been, you had to switch your roof around to make that all work. So you could probably have taken that roof up and then used walls on the side to get, we saw a house earlier, I think it was a blue one in our examples, that sort of had the roof up and then they sort of brought it around the side. So that could have been option 2. And again, this is up on a hill, so you're getting a diminishing visual presence of whatever that change would have been, whereas this doesn't really help you get that visual diminishing presence necessarily. One more. So this is a kind of interesting situation because what we suspect is the case. It's a full second-story addition that is not set back, among other things. It looks like the roof form, which is not any of it left anyways, but if you had seen some of the roof form, it probably would have been the same shape and pitch as the porch. So we suspect from just looking at the photograph that this is probably a shallower roof on top. And that might have been for all sorts of reasons, you never know without talking to folks who designed or built it. But then you have, but even the roof you can see, the one on the right, it's also shallow. So it's sort of like, looks sort of squatty, which is also a technical term. So again, this is a kind of thing where you could probably gotten much of the same square footage with maybe, even if you had a second-story addition with vertical walls, just the way you did the roof to make it, as I think we talked about in our proposal now, is having the roof forms be similar to what's on the house, and this is not that scenario. But you could have gotten much of this probably same square footage, I suspect.
But the relationship of the masses to me is sort of okay.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is that in this case you have a house that is a little wider. It's more likely close to a square shape historically, I would suspect, which is not often the case. And it has a prominent porch that helps sort of give it that presence still, even if you add the second story to it. So yeah, and you could, in this situation, you might have to say, well, I would probably have gotten it maybe a little bit closer. I think this is more the exception than the rule, but this would be an example you probably could have finessed that a little bit to make it work.
So with better roof forms here, even though it's a second-story addition, the fact that the second-story wall is in the same plane as the front wall of the primary structure, that
roof forms would have helped with this.
right. But that wouldn't be even with better roof forms.
This would not. As currently proposed, that would not. This would not be permitted.
Without exception. You could go for an exception.
You could. It'd be tough to make an argument for that because it's not an unusual circumstance. But
Is that louvered vent in the gable typical?
there would have been some sort of vent.
Especially with the porch.
I just didn't
Yeah.
notice it in the other gable
Yeah,
fronts we've seen.
yeah. Sometimes there have been some windows we've seen. We didn't really talk about that very much, but you can see a little one here,
Yeah.
which is actually it would have been in it, so it's not purely decorative. This has windows because this was finished space, even historically. Let me just see real quick. This might have had little windows with a vent in the middle. This would have just been attic space in this front gable, but it would still need to be vented or something.
Just the louver that makes
Yeah.
it look weird.
Yeah, this is the front one is probably historic in this situation. So they're pretty variable. It's kind of interesting to see what folks come up with even in the past with these. Let's see. Yeah, here we are. Roof pitch and form. So in this case, the addition sits right at the front of the house. It's also awkward because it has two parts to it. So we've got a little thing going on with the roof there. The roof pitches seem like they're a little bit off as far as their slope. That's a little more of a subtle comment. But it does have the addition on the side, and it goes off the side of the house. So this would be a second-story addition in our parlance that we've been using, our terminology. So this would, as proposed, would have to be set farther back on this house, among other things. The other thing I'll say is it pretty did get a dead giveaway if you weren't sure is that the round vent
Yeah.
is like it tells you it's not old normally, among other things on this house.
And that part is in line with the front face of the house, right?
The front part is, yeah. The second part is sort of maybe 6, 8 feet back, something like that. And then it, of course, goes even farther than all the way to the back. Essentially, we don't have a view of the left side, but it'd be interesting to see how that sort of works over there, because it's, I don't know, just it's an odd sort of arrangement.
But if that was in the back of the house, that's okay.
Yeah, the second stories would be pushed to the back, yeah. Yeah. Let's see what else we got here. I don't know. This doesn't really show an adequate. Oh, I think that what we're trying. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember all of our comments here. Is there's actually a lot of things going well for this house. I think one of the things we were trying to point out with this is that while you have probably the roof pitch has been changed on this house, given sort of what's underneath it. There's a couple things going on here. I'm not quite sure about it, but the one thing we would want to point out is that it has this sort of odd sort of window sitting on that gable, which I suspect is either for a closet or a bathroom, which is, you know, you might be surprised yourself. The windows have likely all been replaced in the house. Just looking at the one in the gable there, it seems there's some things that we can tell by looking at just in the photograph about the reflection, the reveal, which is the shadow effect. And then you also, not to totally get in the weeds here, but see where that bush is? You see the window behind that bush? You see how the top of that window has a little extra piece of trim that sets it off from that frieze band? We're not talking about this kind of level of detail, but just to give you a sense of what we do in our other districts. So that would be also a sign that's been replaced probably over time, because normally that would be underneath that frieze band. You wouldn't have that extra little lip there. Apart from architecturally speaking, it actually creates a really big water problem, because the water doesn't drip over it does drip over the window unnecessarily.
And it's probably the same plane.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone probably had one with the chimney. So it's the roof thing, and we're not quite sure about it. We want to show the window was the real issue. So this is a example where you have. Remember that house we talked about had the window, the porch was on the side. This is an example of what might have been if it had not been enclosed. This is a little bit earlier version of that style house. But the dormers are added on the house. They probably rebuilt the stoop over the front door. But then they did the addition of back, which is in the back, which is great, but it sort of has this awkward relationship to the front of the house. And so if this had come to us, even in our other districts, and even as currently talked about in this proposed district, we would suggest that they actually do the same space, but actually bring the roof up so that it would block off that awkward sort of vertical wall there. And then still have a roof behind it, but you wouldn't have seen all of that at that point.
Is the one on the left okay?
We're talking about the right-hand side.
Yeah.
So the one on the left, I also suspect is the roof head floor had been changed, so it probably would have been a lower pitch roof. It's a little bit tricky to tell. The windows seem a little bit odd in there. And it's an awfully steeply pitched roof for what probably was a bungalow, because you don't see those other steeply pitched roofs are mostly common with the English vernacular Tudor styles, which are those we were talking about. So, but not that style. But this is a common technique, to maybe your point, this is a common technique to get headroom to put a second story on and not add a full second story, is you tip the roof up or change the pitch. And so you get a house that seems like it's all together, like it sort of works together, but that would not have been the original arrangement of the house likely. Here we got, I think this is probably a full second story on the house, and there's a lot going on in the front. I guess to sort of summarize it. Again, they probably use the same technique as the house that was to the left here, but even more so here, which is probably even more steeply pitched.
It looks cute here.
But to example, though, if this had been a new house from scratch, you actually could make an argument this actually works well together as an ensemble, as a collection of a new design. But if you were adding to the current house, it might be more problematic. At least the way we've currently described the scenario.
The awning over the windows on the right. That's kind of weird.
It is, yeah, it'd be pretty unusual to find that. If there was in some of the other neighborhoods we deal with, if you had a more sophisticated style house, a higher style house, we probably might have seen that, but it also even would have not have been that. It would have been something even not that. It's pretty unusual. So the other thing I'll tell you that's a interesting thing they did here, also totally in the weeds, but just so y'all, since you're all listening to me tonight, I'll say all this. See that the windows on the right, the two that are stacked? So they have that extra space between them. And that's because, of course, originally these would have been windows with weight pockets.
Yeah.
So you had that space for the weight, but if you look at the windows in the dormer, they don't have that. Now, again, if it were a new house, you'd say, well, that's all, works okay, we're not in that level of detail, it's not our concern, whatever the issue is. But if you were to put that window on the original house, and this comes up a lot in our other districts where we have more particular requirements, we would make them space the windows out to get that effect of the weight pocket. So that's often another telltale sign that there's something new's been going on. And I think that might be the last one. Let's see. Yep. All right. So that was residential. So we want to talk a little about industrial. Is that right? Great. So let me put my glasses on so I can see what's happening.
It's the next one over.
Yep. Is that it?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to full screen. All right. So now we're going to talk about industrial buildings, and some of these would also apply to what you might consider to be commercial buildings, which are just often smaller versions of industrial buildings, and vice versa. And the one thing that's interesting about commercial buildings in general, industrial buildings in particular, is that they're actually more organized and have a lot of similarities because they often just deal with windows and where there's not windows. So it's much more of a pattern kind of thing going on, and you'll see that come up several times here. So this is an actual historic building that has been added to. In the front, you can see that sort of parking deck maybe, or whatever that is in the front there. But this is from somewhere else, I believe. These are from Caleb from one of his travels, if I'm not mistaken. Big windows. The windows themselves might have been replaced on this building, but it's hard to tell at this distance. But it's very, very simple detailing, but there are multi-pane windows. Historically, one of these windows would have opened, but only one section of the window would have opened. Then this happens to be a concrete building, so it's concrete with some maybe a little parch coat on the outside. You can do some of that detailing and whatnot. And it has a flat roof, which is also pretty typical of an industrial building, or almost flat roof, let's put it that way. That's sort of the positive. This is a new construction property. This is in the King District. This is on, and I'll talk a lot about this because I actually reviewed this project. The first one I ever reviewed new construction years ago. It's at Randolph and Edgewood. So this is a pretty big building. In this case, we try to get the idea of the large sets of windows, very simple brickwork, but also articulating those downspouts. It's an industrial building. It doesn't even look so fancy, if you will. And then we can't see in this picture, but you can go see in person if you can look at it. It's a very long building. And so what we did is we had them break up the building by putting a very modern entrance in the middle of it. There's actually two buildings that look like they've been joined by this kind of funky, postmodern actually kind of detail. And so the building is probably, 300 some feet long, but it doesn't look that way visually off the top of your head, off the top of your back.
Is that a totally new building?
It's completely new.
What was there before?
Parking lot. It's 3 stories. The bottom's retail. This is, I think, the interior face, so it has apartments, but on the street facade, it's retail. Different, hairstyle place, whatever is down there. And they have parking in the back, so the building is sort of like on Randolph, and the parking's in the back there. So, and this is actually just a little bit taller than the only other tall building in this area, which is the Belton Company building, which is down Edgewood Avenue, but it's the same sort of proportionality to it. Adaptive reuse building, 2-story, pretty simple, straightforward. They kept the openings, which is one of the main features, again, this window, non-window pattern we're talking about. That, what you call sometimes the solid and the void effect. So they use some steel to help with their structure, might have been failing or old or what have you. And then they, put windows in, they cut some, they put interior exterior space, looks like some sort of a balcony or a patio for eating, drinking, something like that.
And this is no building.
This is adaptive reuse.
Is that Lee and White? Yes. Lee and White building over by I-20. So
Yeah.
it's the brewery and your distillery, and then it's a restaurant off the back, and then we'll go there and buy a store.
This is described as a non-historic building, which I would tend to disagree with that, given its age, probably from the 50s, which in that part of the city would be a historic building.
Doug, in the previous photo of the new construction, why are the retail spaces so low? Why isn't the first floor ceiling higher?
That's a great question because the aesthetic of that, this is again Randolph and Edgewood, so if you go across the street, the thumbs up, which is what's there now, but at the time it wasn't there, but it's not the typical 14 or 12 foot ceiling height in retail, so we had this match that distance,
Do
volume.
you all have a recommendation for the height of the first floor?
Well,
I mean, in something that wouldn't be.
yeah, so for most new construction mixed-use buildings, i.e. commercial on the ground floor and something else above, office or residential, either one, it doesn't matter. Most retailers are looking for at least a 14-foot ceiling in their ground floor space. Historically, that does occur. If you think about some buildings on Highland Row or farther up in Virginia Highland, they actually have pretty tall ceilings, but the outside, they look lower because of the way they've structured the window wall proportionality. So if you go in any of those shops, if you look up, they haven't dropped the ceiling. The ceiling looks more than you expect it to be. Urban Outfitters is another great example, even though it's a more modern building because it's from the after these 20th time period.
Did Caleb mention the ceiling height in one of his talks? I feel like
Yes, he did.
someone.
I think the draft
Well,
guys say 16.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking
Does
too.
anybody have?
Look, I am.
Yeah, and the reason why that, apart from there's a sense of space that they get, is that they can also, because all their mechanicals are separated from what's above them. So they can't run things through the floor, which is what you might do in an all residential building, for example. They have to, there's code requirements to separate non-living space from living space for fire and so on and so forth. All the mechanicals run below that divider.
It's 16 feet forward.
I think the ground floor that it's specified in the next use, are you looking at it?
Right here. Ground floor height, floor 16, the upper floor height is 10 feet.
Yeah.
That's specific and
One thing about the first floor height, which is really an issue for commercial buildings more so than residential, because we can have pretty good comparison points for residential, is that the generally taller the building is, the bigger the first floor can be height-wise and still look like it fits in. Even not just thinking about historic stuff, just in general, that works out pretty well. And that also, to the point about, we do have areas in the neighborhood that are proposed to be in the district that have, that are non-residential, obviously, and we all know where those are. So the question is, those areas, you can have lots of infill opportunities, both by keeping what might be there and adding to it, but also new things from the ground up that can have some of these general questions of proportionality if we're looking to have them be sort of look historic-esque, which is even not required right now in the proposal. But if you did that, and you still have the flexibility within that sort of patterning to get different kind of spaces in those buildings.
I thought Jim was going to increase that 16 to 16 feet.
So one last thing here that I want to talk about is this is a historic building. This is one of Caleb's photographs. Again, very plain building. This probably was some sort of manufacturing or warehouse building historically. But you see, again, the wall window pattern is really the only thing that's helping you sort of get a sense of that age or time period. Windows in this case look like they've been retained, but maybe the glass has been replaced, which is a common thing. These are steel windows, and the reason why I say that to the architect sitting in the middle here is that they do still have the hopper style or awning style window in the middle of that frame, which you'd be surprised if someone would do that if they replaced the windows, unless they're really doing a pretty high-end renovation.
Is there something over that door? It looks like,
It looks like there's what we call a ghost mark,
yeah.
which is the remnants of something else. It looks like it's some tar, paper tar, some caulk or something. There might have been a little, we don't know the history of the building, but there might have been a loading area off the second floor, depending on what they were loading or unloading. There could have been a catwalk that might have connected this building to another building that's out of the picture. I mean, that's possible. So you didn't go up and downstairs to move
It
crates
seems
or
like
whatever.
that floor would be lower than the flanking floor
Yeah.
plates too.
It's a sort of interesting relationship because
Yeah.
those are, but also the sill might have been higher than a sort of, could have been a chest high sill in the commercial space, you never know. Which means the
Yeah.
floor would have been,
This could be a storage or.
yeah, yeah. And this, very basic brickwork, there's just a little bit of a cap on that little sort of column, you would call it a pilaster often, but there's nothing on the roof, it just ends there, Very functional building, nothing in that regard. And so, you can have relatively straightforward industrial buildings, and you can also have a building that looks like Ford Factory, which is also still an industrial building, but they had a different sense of what they were designing for, at least the Ford company did at the time, of what they were trying to present as their imagery for their corporation. And if you go around all over the United States, you can see what are only warehouses that are like amazingly architecturally detailed, and they're storing stuff in it.
Did you
So
mention the Ford factory? What was the rationale for painting the parking lot side of that? It's so beautiful on the Hunt City Market side. It's just the original brick. So was that just because that was their idea of modernizing it to
I would
tie in
assume
retail space?
white is a very interesting, people love white today, design-wise, or light gray.
But it really doesn't look historic at all because of that. Whereas the backside, you get the
Yeah.
sense of the old.
Yeah.
A lot of that brick needs repair too, and so they painted over it instead of painted over it. Just cream.
All right, so do we have a contemporary package too? Did I miss that? Is it this one? Yeah, okay. So we're gonna pick up the pace a little bit, if you don't. As you know from previous experience, I could talk all night about architecture, so, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. All right, so contemporary housing. So one of the things that's in the proposal now is the idea that if you have infill opportunity, we're talking about back to houses now, that one of the options would be a contemporary design. I'm not good about otherwise, I'm just saying that's currently on the table. And it was a new idea that we incorporated into let's
That's
see.
a good sign.
Let's try it. Let's make sure we got the right. Let me try this. So, yeah, I'm trying to think of what's. Let me try something.
That's when you were saying it's a very modern house.
You can't even see it. It's absolute black is the color. Absolute black is the color. Let's see, what can we do here? Let's try closing it all over again. How's that? Start with the basics here. It's not even in that, it's fine. Let me see if I can, what can I do here?
You can repopulate that in there, what's on the side.
Yeah?
You can repopulate it?
Yeah. So, while Jerry's doing that, one of the ideas on the table is that you can have contemporary or non-traditional designed houses that would have some parameters or some limitations on their general size, orientation, as in where the front door is, and sort of defining this box you get to work within, but then within that there'd be more flexibility to have these contemporary concepts that we hopefully can show you all real quick. And the idea is that, to the question earlier about the idea of some differentiation, we talked about that earlier as far as additions and alterations go. This is the ultimate in that concept, which is you would have something would be, say, proportionality, height, setback, what have you, but would be of its own time. It would be just its own expression. Bill, I think you have a question?
Oh, wait, it looks like he's.
Oh, right, excellent, excellent, thank you. So here's a, how, I'm not, these are in the area, right, is that?
They're in there.
No, they're in this area of
Those
town?
are in Virginia Highland.
Yeah, okay. So you can go see these for yourself if you want. So in our assessment, these are some things that are, we think are problematic to this idea of contemporary design.
Yeah.
So it's hard to tell because of the shadows, but you have what appears to be some sort of a marble or granite face. Then you have the brick, which you can see sort of the brownish brick there on the left, and you got some wood and some metal. That, in our view, is sort of too much of a mix of materials. Then you have some what we consider to be some proportion problems. This is where you really, it is kind of get a finely tuned conversation here. But so you have presumably the two-story house, maybe basement, not quite sure. But because of the way it's designed, that second story looks bigger than the first story. So it's sort of usually it's either even or the reverse, as we've been talking about with our more traditional houses.
This is where illuminating comes in.
Yeah, and then it has, it's a little bit hard to tell as well, but of course that is all, there's glass, display glass underneath that marble or granite, and then there's some sort of vertical ribbon windows, I guess are above the door. It's hard to tell from the shadows. The door looks to be red, to give you your indication. Yeah, so that's above the door. You have the cantilevered sort of false wall on the left, stuff like that. Yeah.
Enough said.
Yeah.
Now, wait a second.
It's got the garage in the front, you're not gonna talk about the things that you can't do.
Yeah, so this is one of the things, we talk about defining a box, but there are some things that we felt at least that would be worthwhile to consider. In our case, we very much advocate for, which is not allowing the garage in the front, even if you have a contemporary house. And there, as was pointed out, there are ways to seek hardship exceptions, which would have to be with the physicality of the lot, not just aesthetic issues. Then you have things about the windows here. This is raw concrete. It's hard to maybe tell on the slide, but it's poured in place concrete. It's unfinished. And again, it's not a good or bad judgment-wise. It's just that this is the if you have some parameters, this might be things you'd be looking out for to prevent on even a contemporary house, if that was of interest to the neighborhood. Same here. This is stucco covered poured-in-place concrete, probably, or maybe framed material. You got a couple different materials. You got some window things going on. You have what appears to be the door that has a glass railing getting up to it, plate glass windows, these fins or these sort of projecting walls.
But,
Yeah, sure.
this is starting to break down the scale.
Yes.
More so than the ones before.
Yeah. So that's a good point.
Sort of getting the volumes of what
Yeah.
is around. Well, like that left-hand volume could be repeated on that house to the left of it in certain ways. It doesn't loom over that house, which is a two-story house or something. It's not even-
So it has the 3 levels of windows, which the windows themselves might be a little, conversation starter, but it looks like the house next door also appears to be 3 stories. That's sort of one way to think about it. This has a flat roof, which is not unusual for a contemporary house, but it also has a couple different planes. One, you could, if you sort of squint your eyes, you can see the left side is projecting out like maybe a 2-story house would have a projection on the left, and the right side is sort of back. I mean, you're just sort of getting there a little
It's
bit.
way up on the hill.
And it's on a hill, so that it actually is to its advantage. But there is no windows on the side at all, which,
Clearly, there's there might be some design issues with
yeah,
Yeah.
it. But, on its positive side,
yeah.
it's breaking down the scale.
So so it's as currently described and on the table for discussion is if you do infill, you have 2 options, which is a contemporary option, and there are examples of contemporary design that are better than what we just showed. I don't think we necessarily have.
We didn't find anything.
You didn't find it? Okay. Maybe we can.
I found more, but I just couldn't get them all
Yeah.
into the thing.
So this is an example of, this is a completely new house. It has a lot of things. So this would be a traditional infill approach. You'd be looking at using quality that already exists in the neighborhood in some way to build a new house to fit in. In most people's eyes, this would be trying to fit in with the neighborhood, you know, more or less. So you have a pretty amounts to a Tudor English vernacular sort of style. It has a steeply pitched roof. It has that little flare on the bottom, which is another thing that we haven't seen before. It does actually have a very unusual roof shape, and then it has 3 sets of gables you can see on the right-hand side, which, apart from having to be a really good roofer to make that work, you know, you got water, whatever. I'll leave all that aside. I would say there's a couple things on this that would give me a little pause, but it does have a lot of things going for it. It has some unusual window shapes for a traditional style house, as in the skinny window by the front door, which you can actually sort of, you can make an argument for that in some ways. Because it uses the roof to its advantage, it's actually not that big of a house as it could have been otherwise, you know, because that second story is completely in the roof shape. It has some dormers, which is typical of this style house. So, yeah. But at the same time, it does have, if you look at that window in the left-hand side, it's a, you know, it looks like probably a fixed or almost a fixed window, and so it doesn't have that separation. So it gives there's a little bit of contemporary flair in there that you might otherwise have not had in the you know, if this had been original. Yeah, it's a lot of blank wall, relatively speaking.
Is the style of the bottom window, the large one on the left, okay?
The fact it's vertical is, you know, typical of a house that's seeming to be to this era or earlier. What we're saying is that there's not a lot of window for that amount of wall.
I'm just asking about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what they're doing with their bottom, but they have probably a full basement in this house. And on the left-hand side is probably windows that give them the amount of daylight they need, because the right-hand side, you can see it's rising grade with the driveway. But they probably get their window from the left-hand side. And so you have this wall, you can maybe see it a little bit. You see there's a little bump there in the wall? Right where the first floor would be?
Yeah.
So that's probably where the first floor is, among other things. But that gives that, because it's raised up, it gives more sort of wall presence than you want.
What's the funny little thing next to the dormer?
To the left?
Yeah.
I suspect that there was something about the way they designed the house that somehow they couldn't figure out how to get a head height issue inside, and they sort of put this thing on there.
Wouldn't it look better if they just made it black or roofing?
Well, that too, but I would argue you probably could have figured out a different way to arrange the rooms. And
Yeah, I mean, it's so weird. But
yeah.
I'd rather see that than the totally modern.
This one has a lot that slopes up, and so there's a garage behind it all, and it's running up to that.
Yeah.
It's going back.
You can, it's hard to tell, but there's actually, looks like the fence stops, but actually the fence keeps going back. And so, yeah.
There's a basement window in the front.
Yeah, there's definitely the full basement of this house. This house would not be built without a full basement, just given the size and effort they went to the rest of the house.
So Doug, are you saying that this is, with the regulations, the new regulation, that's going to be okay? Because I know that's okay right now.
Yeah.
In the current zoning laws, that's okay to build.
Yeah, assuming it meets the height is usually a big issue, but yeah.
Right, always the height
Yeah.
and the setbacks. But are you saying that that's going to be allowed, or there's certain design things?
Yeah, so when we look at our key elements table here, we talk about a mix of compatible and incompatible features. And the things we just talked about, there's a little bit scant on the windows for this style of house.
Right.
There's the thing that's on the roof there, which we're not sure of. But there's a lot of things going for it, which is it has a roof that matches with the form. It has a porch. It has, has some windows that are creating a pattern. It's brick, which is obviously pretty common material. It's the one thing about this that's kind of interesting is this idea of how they put roofs over the rest of the house, as far as this idea of the form thing. And I just don't quite follow that, but
Do you
there
think
must be a
this is a
reason.
single-family house?
I would think so. Yeah.
It's a single family house,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a custom home.
Yeah.
It was built for the person. It wasn't a spec house. That's what he wanted.
So this is a
By
new.
Piedmont Park off
Yeah.
of Park Drive as you're going from Monroe.
Yeah. Another example of a house that's gets some of the things right. You can see we have both compatible and incompatible listed there. So the dormer on top is kind of a something going on there. You have an unusual sort of porch, but sort of stoop. It's sort of in between. You probably would have done. We probably argued one or the other, given the kind of house. It's probably close to a square house, given just the way the windows are laid out from the front. But it has, it has brick. It has some nice detailing on the windows. The windows themselves have some nice proportionality. So it's, as we say, sort of maybe partway there from our respect. It has nice roof, some nice roof detailing. Yeah, and it looks like it's not even lived in yet because there's no furniture in it.
Linda Barlow.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Made a comment about the metal.
Yeah,
Uh,
that has
standing
roof on the
seam
porch.
roof.
That
Yeah.
doesn't seem like,
Because it's slow, it's hard to put a shingle
it's
roof.
too shallow.
Right.
Or it looks weird.
And it-
Well, I've done it and it doesn't look as bad as that. No.
I know, but I'm just saying for,
Yeah.
if you're trying to make it look compatible, that's certainly not
You
compatible,
could-
is your telling
You
us.
could move the roof up a
Yeah.
little bit up to its slope, but there's still a minimum slope.
Yeah, I would, if this had come to our, in another district that we were reviewing it, I would argue that the way to solve that problem would actually be to lower the porch roof in the front,
Yeah.
because you see there's this extra sort of, it looks sort of stretched out, the porch.
Uh-huh.
I guess it could just a little bit more than it should be. And so that's what we probably would have responded to on this, along with some other things we've already talked
Or
about.
the windows above it just be even higher sill.
Yeah, that could be too. That's why I think we had a question back here.
Going back to the previous home and the placement of the porch,
Yeah.
if your neighbors had porches on the fronts of their homes, wouldn't this not be cohesive with your neighbors? And that the living space is pushed out and the porches are sensitive?
Yeah, great point. I can't remember what we did for porches here as far as their size and proportionality. I think we have some minimum size requirements for porches, if I'm not mistaken, as a part of the proposal. So that might be a feature that might not have made it through this. I don't have it in front of me. Yeah. One of the things that we really, that one of the ways to approach the infill new construction is that you would be looking for internal consistency as much as potentially in relationship to other things on the street. Because I think it's one of the ideas that you can have a variety of features and buildings in the neighborhood, which we already have. And so if you put a new one in, you don't necessarily have to have it meet what's down the street as long as it has some sort of other parameters trying to qualify for it. And we have there's a mix of things already, so that's.
So the internal consistency is referring to establishing pattern, some repetition of pattern.
No, that's a good point. Internal consistency, we use that term, which I don't think have in the regulations right now, the proposed regulations, is internal to that particular house. So if you had a house that was a one-story and it was purporting to be a bungalow, for example, you wouldn't have 4 windows in a row. Because that would not be internally consistent with what's the established, known way of arranging that kind of house. But if you had a Tudor-style house, which this is sort of like that, you might have that situation. And the porch is another example. I'm talking about this house.
And traditionally, how does that play into setbacks? So if I have a setback for a home, is my porch at the start of the setback, or is it?
Yeah, great question. It comes up all the time, all over the city of Atlanta. So in non-historic neighborhoods, non-historic district neighborhoods, I should say, you measure the setback to the front wall, the main wall of the house, and the porch can project into the setback a certain distance, which is a fixed number. And one thing they'll say about in our other historic districts is we, again, usually having some sort of reference to what's around you, particularly on setbacks, because even though there might be different house styles or forms or even sizes, they're usually still relatively lined up, particularly to the front of the walls of the house. So that's something that you think about.
So how would that house line up with, if you had a row of homes with porches on the front? That projection out the front, would that sit behind the porches?
It could sit,
The previous one?
the previous one?
Yeah, would that sit
Would we
Was
say
that
that as a
projection set in line with all the porches, or would it set in the front line of all of them?
Well, given sort of what we just used in our other districts, we have a lot more experience in those areas. We would have the front of that projection line up with the farthest forward front of another house. Because that's where the main volume of the house is where that's where it's.
But not
the
the
porch.
But not
But it's
necessarily.
not the porch, you're right. Now, I would say that, and Dick brought up a good point, was that this is really more of a stoop than a porch. But I would also say that if this had come to us in another district, we probably would have had some concerns about the way the porches were arranged. Because even in other neighborhoods, it's kind of an unusual configuration.
Because you can't put furniture there, which I think a porch has to be
Yeah.
habitable.
So let's keep going forward. Couple things here. These are not, we're sort of showing these in-between examples, I guess. So a couple concerns here. This is, it looks like we're starting as a new house. So you have a lot of things going for it really well. This is it has a lot of internal consistency with the roof form, the brick, the arch window, the steep roof going back. But then there's other things that sort of don't work so well. You have these different roof planes in the front underneath that eave. So you have one set of windows and they're like 2 feet later there's another set of windows. You have a really unusual shape to the dormer roof. It really rides up there a lot. You have a unusually skinny chimney. And again, if you're in a neighborhood that this is where they wanted to go with their apartments, these are the kind of things we would be saying about this kind of a house.
Right.
If it had come to us in another neighborhood, for example.
So what would they have done differently? Like, I'm sure they arranged those window dormers according to the house, internal house plan.
Yeah, but think about it though, in this scenario, in most dormer scenarios, everything that's above, a few feet above the top of the window is just extra space. Like it's not, you're not using it to do anything.
Yeah.
So there's no reason for it to go that far up the roof.
But would it then have had a very different slope than over the little one if they had shortened it?
Well, you'd have to do both. You'd make both dormers the same proportionality.
What are you talking about?
The roof of the dormer, how it rides up the roof.
Oh, that one's high up there.
Yeah.
Well, it's more forward too.
Yeah.
Just to get it to hit the roof. But that could be also a sloped ceiling in there.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a reason why you need it, you want it, but it wouldn't be necessary to have it that way. Let's put it that way. So this is sort of, think about these other houses that we looked at. This one, and then that one. So this is we think that's much more right than not. Again, if you were in another neighborhood that has, this is the kind of things we're focusing on. Has roof form and windows, work, proportionality. This has a lot of features of this style of house, this form of a house.
I'm looking at the cobbles.
So this has a lot of positive things going for it, I guess that's what I'd say. It's internally consistent. They have probably a fair amount of square footage, but the second floor is totally in the roof form, the attic, what would have been the attic otherwise.
Is this a new house?
This is a new house.
Why is the chimney so, I mean, it looks massive compared to looks out of scale with us.
Yeah, so on this style of house, in this form of a house, which would be an English vernacular Tudor-esque style, again, if this is what was in the neighborhood we were dealing with, that actually is an important feature of that kind of a house. It's actually relatively common to have that on the front.
And it balances the left-hand side volumes
Yeah.
in relationship to the roof.
Yeah, that's one of the things that for this type of house, this is what's probably one of the more unusual things. The chimneys often go to the front, which just has to do with how the rooms were arranged and what people thought about living in that house, that kind of thing. On most houses, they'd be to the side or internal to the roof or the back. But this particular kind of house, it's not particularly unusual with it. And if you go, I mean, just as you go around, you look at neighborhoods where they have original houses of this time period, the historic ones, you'll see that's pretty common. They wouldn't necessarily all be white.
Right. Maybe that's why it stands out
Yeah.
so.
So this is a good, so maybe we have, okay, great. So modern house, infill, I'm sorry.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
It's more about sort of the review process. I mean, a lot of what you're describing, as best I can tell, doesn't seem to be all that objective. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is like when you guys do a review and you say like, oh, the chimney's too skinny, what is the actual recommendation? Is it to make the chimney a particular width, or just wider, or, you know, I guess, what does that conversation look like when you guys review?
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation to start with.
Okay.
And so, because in our other districts, you're usually having your requirements reference something that already exists. Other than like you're saying, you're comparing to something that's nearby or down the street or whatever the relationship is. You usually use that as the benchmark to say it should be more closely tied to that or the same as that, something like that.
Along those same lines, are you willing to do a review when it's in an earlier design stage? So when the architect's doing some schematic sketches, to be able to give feedback earlier on rather than all the way at the end of construction documents?
We do it all the time. When people ask us, some people don't ask. We're happy to do it.
It seems like that should be recommended.
Yeah. Well, we do recommend it, but you know. I think it sort of speaks for itself. Well, this is a beautiful house, but if we're looking at the things we're outlining now as the box we're working in, this would not meet those requirements for a contemporary infill. Some people have a different view of that. I understand that, I'm just saying.
One of the things I was trying when I captured that photograph was just the idea that it doesn't have to be stone, it could be brick. You know, I was trying to say that there's this notion of what materials do you finish it with, not what is just the shape, but there's a combination of the materials and the shape that go together that can make it either look like it really blends in or not so much.
Yeah. And I assume the front of the house is to the right here.
That's the side of it, the front is, I've got another view that he didn't include.
So in the current draft of the regs, this is incompatible because of the type of stone and the wood finish?
I would say that it'd be the combination of materials and not knowing the front per se. It looks like it's a corner lot or close to a corner lot.
It is a corner lot.
Yeah. Actually, we spent a little bit more on the front of the house, which we don't see here, but I think from this view, it
has so many trees, it's hard to see in front of it.
See where the entry is.
I don't think we can see the entry. I think this is the side yard facing the cross street. And then this garage would be facing the rear, but you'd come in from the side of the house.
Is that in Camden Park?
No, it's in Virginia Highland.
Highland Terrace on Highland.
Yes.
This is sort of the house, one of the houses we saw earlier, which is it has a front door facing the street, but it has the large display window wall essentially. Has the sort of the box effect of the second story. Again, the question here is not necessarily whether this is good or bad, but given what sort of parameters we laid out so far, this would be problematic in our view if we were to review this house coming forward.
What else with the scale and volume?
The scale could be pretty right on the money. You can see a little bit of a house next door, and it looks like this is bigger, but in absolute terms it might be the same height. But because this house has a slope roof and this has a flat roof, it's going to look bigger from the street.
So do you have any examples of more modern contemporary designs that would meet the proposed regulations?
So I think we do, which I think is what these are. Yeah, okay. So the house we're looking at is the house to the White House to the right, not the second White House, but the first White House. The house to the left is the original house on the street. So in this situation, you have, what we're arguing here is you have, this must have met the 35-foot height limit because this is clearly not compatible with what's next door, but putting that aside for just a minute. You have a house that has some basic requirements that haven't quite shown up in the other house, which is you have the front door facing the street, you have vertically proportioned windows, you have a little bit broken down roof form, there's no driveway, there's no garage in the front, which was a couple of the houses we looked at. And it actually looks like it's shorter, if you can imagine, to the house to the right, which is even taller than this one. And this combines the traditional roof form on the front, and then it looks like it has a little flat roof section on the side. This would be one of the things about a contemporary style in a house, which is a pretty amorphous group, is that because it's not referencing what's around it necessarily, there's actually more that can be going on with it. And arguably, we'd have we, as a city staff, reviewing this, have less ability to shape that form because it's not referencing something that already exists in the neighborhood.
I have a question. As
Yeah.
it relates to this, to Muncie Highland, as it's been suggested or proposed. We talked about this notion of design, and we also talked about scale. Here, there's no real control of scale or design. If we were to take this design, which I think parts of it could be used, would it work if you scaled it down so it didn't dwarf the things around it?
The short answer is yes. I mean, depending on what was allowed, this could also in and of itself be compatible, but it appears, I would suspect that the house is more like what's on the left going down the street.
That's on Morningside.
Yeah. So, and, you know, the house to the right of the one we're talking about was also probably demolition and rebuild. And this is the same thing, I'm sure. So the idea is that you could also approach this by saying, if you're going to do the contemporary option, if you want to call it that really the biggest concern might be the height, making the setbacks fit in, a few things maybe like garage doors or a front door, so you get that relationship to the street, but maybe the rest of it we're okay with. Maybe something else.
The size is massive. Isn't this exactly what we've all been talking about that we want to prevent?
We are, which is why we're talking about the height being the biggest issue.
This is just about the style of it, contemporary, not the scale of it, right?
That's terrible. That's
This is a new
This is
house.
the style of
Yes.
something, not the scale of something. The scale of thing tells you what you don't want to do probably, based on what the feedback I've heard from people. But I was just trying to find something that showed style that would sort of fit, and then we can all imagine kind of a smaller version.
But no porch on it.
No porch of the stoop.
Goes to-
Is that
That's
requirement in the
considered a
valley
stoop.
overlay?
Fortress too.
Valley overlay, I'll make those,
So the poor person who lives in that smaller house, as soon as that house is built, their value went down
Yes.
immensely.
Can I ask a height question? So, I think the way I read this was you've got 35 feet from the midpoint, from the average from the street to the base level?
No, not quite.
Okay.
Um,
It's, the way I read it was almost like if you're on a hill, it automatically pulls your max height down. At least on a castle.
I don't think so.
It's my interpretation.
Hill
Yeah.
used to read.
Normally, even in our historic districts, we measure height, and I think the way it's trying to get it here is that it's measured the front facade, which is the front wall of the house,
Yeah.
from the ground around the bottom of the wall
Uh-huh.
to the peak of the roof or the top of the wall, whichever is higher.
Okay.
It's only in the front.
And it's only in the front, as currently
It used to
drafted.
be the average of the slope.
But still the case in non-historic districts, that's still how it works.
Okay.
What if they add 5 feet of dirt though?
Right now, you can't do that, and we could have that be part of our consideration as well.
I thought that's what they did with these the townhomes at, next to Manual. They look like they're about 5 feet up.
Yeah, the parking lot used to be.
No, but they also probably have a higher height limit than
Yeah.
the zoning.
And have stoop.
They probably could work with more than 35 feet there, I suspect.
So, Doug, are we trying to describe what the parameters are in this code of what we think? Because I don't know that we've agreed that we want contemporary houses and infill that's not compatible with the rest of the neighborhood.
That's
To
true.
me, that's a big question before we start drafting all this code of what a contemporary infill house ought to look like.
If I'm not mistaken, I think that's one of the questions that's on the next round of survey, which is, should infill be traditional or contemporary looking, or is that even a choice? Because one thing that I'll just say about the structure of the potential set of requirements, that you can remove that option, if you will, because it's sort of a self-encapsulated piece, and not have it be too problematic as far as logistics go, as far as getting a product out.
I mean, there is one part of our neighborhood closer to the Beltline that already has a mix of contemporary
Yeah.
homes in
I
it.
know,
and it
but
doesn't
that
have-
doesn't mean we have to have it scattered through the rest of the neighborhood.
I agree, it's already sort of segmented as its own zone, so perhaps it stays there.
Stays there,
There
yeah.
there probably aren't that many spots that you can actually build
That's true.
Well-
Not houses, there's.
not houses.
Yeah, but you're not because you haven't lived here for 37 years, we have, you don't know what all can happen in the future and what can be condemned. Like they wanted to condemn the house next to you because, quote, it was unstructured, you know, not structurally safe or something in the basement.
Well, that's
And
because they
that-
wanted to build a new house, not build.
I know that, that's
All
exactly my
right,
point.
so we're gonna,
And
we
so-
are like having a great time, but we are just like burning through time.
Yeah.
Boy, like I said, you'll need to keep me on a leash better next time about talking about architecture.
May I just say one thing about contemporary? You know, I love bungalows, I love our style and all that stuff, but there are good examples
Yeah.
that, of contemporary design.
But they can have it somewhere else.
You know, I would
They're
like the
not historic to this
opportunity. I would
neighborhood.
like the opportunity.
Caleb talked about the contextual contemporary, so we haven't really seen any pictures
That
of
is.
that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was asking about an example, because the last slide, I would argue, I mean, except for the portion going down the side,
This one.
yeah, that, you know, those, the front roof form is still relating to something that's more traditional rather than a true modern. And so you gave examples of moderns that you thought were incompatible, that were truly, you know, a modern design. And so I was just wondering if you had any examples of a truly modern design that would
Yeah, let me
somehow
see.
still meet the
Yeah.
the compatibility from the scale standpoint and, you know, porch and that type of stuff.
Oh, well, Caleb's examples.
Yeah, these are all, I think, his examples, or many of them are his examples. Some of them are ones that Jerry took, if I'm not mistaken. So, we don't have a lot of good examples of that. I mean, it's-
See how it could be compatible with our neighborhood, and even considered modern.
I think the one thing to consider, and this is, it's hard because we have the visual up in front of us when we're talking about it, is this idea of think of it as a question of framework, or is it like sort of what's the box you're going to work in? Because like I think I said more than once before, and even tonight, is that the referential requirements, there's something you're comparing them to, you know, like I said, either next door, down the street, or on the block, or whatever the frame of reference is. And so to your question about the chimney and all that stuff, I'll say here's sort of the universe is defined in some ways by what's around you. And the trade-off, if you will, for the flexibility to have the opportunity for a great design that might be contemporary is that because it's not referencing something else, it's harder to sort of get your arms around that as an administrator of a design review process. Because when we have someone say your chimney needs to be X, Y, Z different, I'm able to say, because of what the interests of this district and what we've established as the intent of the district, is that this is the reason why I can have you do that, because that's what was agreed upon as the standard for the neighborhood. And I can point to other things that have done that. And that's, you can't do that as much with this concept. I mean, it's definitely a trade-off, for sure.
And without a historic district, these kind of modern homes can be built anyway.
Yeah, again, usually the height is the biggest qualifier, yeah. These were built.
Yeah, they are, but.
Those are in fourth ward.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Down the 35-foot height limit, do you see historic districts ever exceeding that and like relaxing that restriction, or do they typically do it now?
No, we have two ways we've done it based on the neighborhood conversations that we had with those folks. In Grand Park, they just kept the same height, 35 feet, and they kept the same measuring technique, which actually gives you bigger than a 35-foot tall house. To the layperson, it's bigger than 35 feet, because it is. Or, which is now more common, is we have a technique which is no taller than the tallest, usually on your block is a common benchmark. And then that's measured in what we call absolute terms, which is you measure from the ground to the top of the house, wherever that top is. So if there's a roof, you know, because what people are doing with the 35-foot height here, I suspect, is that, among other things, because you're measuring not really to the absolute height of the house, you have this extra space you can build in, and it's really ends up being a 40-foot tall house, for example. In the way most people would measure. If you measure something, you don't measure it, you know, like from here to there, you measure from there to there. You're not, you know, so it's this, and there's a reason why that was done historically in the city of Atlanta, not historically as a historic district, but as far as administering the code. But we can deal with it better in a historic district if that's the interest of the folks involved. And we can actually get the house to be the house that fits in, which is, you can't do with that other technique, I guess, that's what it's describing. Because we're looking at the actual architecture and form, whereas the other way, it's just numbers.
I have a quick question. When you think about scale and height, some of the houses that are bigger and taller on bigger lots,
Yep.
per se. Some of the houses that are closer together are on smaller lots. And so if you use the theory that the biggest house can fit on the smallest lot in height, the other house, it dwarfs everything else around it.
Yeah.
Can you tie it where there's this notion of there's a proportionality to this, how much land you have, width-wise, if you will, because these bigger houses tend to be on bigger, wider lots. And you can see it, you go down Linwood, or you can go down Blue Ridge and see it.
Yeah.
That some of the bigger houses don't seem like they're overwhelming the land and the houses around them because they just have more space.
Yeah, I'd say that just as far as a process sort of way to approach that is we would want to deal with the height, because even where you have a wider house typically, I'm not aware of a true 3-story house in the neighborhood unless I missed something along the way. So there's still 2-story houses. They might be wider because the lot's wider, but they're probably not necessarily still much taller.
Some of them are taller because they're deeper and they did 2-story with a lot of roofs,
Yeah,
and they're just bigger. You can see it on Linwood, the ones that are and the ones that aren't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the older homes don't fit in what will be current setbacks either, so the house would be
Most of them
wider
probably
than
don't.
permitted,
Yeah.
so built something to it skinny and tall.
Yeah, because they're going to use the maximum height
And FAR.
in FAR. It's whatever's allowed for them.
Just wondering if there's a way to do that to
Yeah,
balance the two.
yeah. And there could be. I think that we have a pretty good. There's a pretty good option about just the height question, because your setbacks are also going to be. So there's I think in the proposal now I think based on what's on your block.
They put it like bottom numbers, like
Okay.
3 and 5, but we haven't really actually surveyed.
Yeah. No. So I think the key thing, without trying to get too much over reach, if you will, is just trying to really focus on the question of height and looking at reference what's around you.
Right.
I think you could get some pretty good results from that, that's a pretty accepted technique, I guess, of how to deal with that. But there's other options, but we've been pretty successful with that.
So like when you do that, like in the sense of like, let's say houses, you talk about like floor height, right? So
Mhm.
like, most of the houses there are 9 foot, I guess some of them are 10-foot floor heights, not taller than that. Is that still part of that formula too, where you're repeating floor height patterns, not just the total height of the house?
Talk about like new construction? Usually not, because when we think, we're thinking about what the focus of the district, or our districts are on normally, is of course just the exterior. So I guess people have done this, people have done some pretty wacky things inside, but as long as the outside has the proportionality that's otherwise required for whatever the regulations might be, if they wanted to, do something weird with their floors inside, then that's up to them. But we don't usually get into that.
You don't
We've
see that from the standpoint of window patterns or any of that kind of?
Well, we do, because the window patterns do matter.
Okay.
That's outside looking into us, which is inside looking in.
So from the outside, that's to look like it's the same scale as what you currently have?
In the district we have now, yeah. Yeah, whatever the requirement is for that area, or that neighborhood, I should say. I think this is all the images.
Yes. And then in the context of time, I think some of the other stuff, I don't know how far you guys want to go in terms of time. There's other material to discuss if you want.
One thing I would like to do is, let's see here.
Add your parameters in there.
Yeah, I do want to touch on this right quick, because we've sort of talked about it before, but what we did is this used to be a longer chart, which sort of the beginnings of the process from last year, and we sort of just got to where we are now. So we're on February 20th, which is today, which you can see right there. And again, we have the 3 columns. The first column is what's PHNA organized meeting. Then we have the middle column, which is called City of Atlanta meeting, which is the hearings we have or things we have downtown, which are the formal conversations, the public hearings. And then the right-hand column is the MPU related / neighborhood general meetings. So we've talked about in the past, where there's these processes that run together. So we have our formal meetings, which are coming up. So our benchmark, the city's benchmark, as far as sort of process and what have you, is on April 2nd or 9th. We're shooting for the 2nd, because if folks don't remember, the 9th is spring break. Just all you families out there. So that's the time period in which we hopefully as a partnership are going to City Hall and saying, here's our proposal for the official regulatory folks at City Hall to consider. And so that's the situation where presumably myself and other folks who want to lead the conversation come down and say, here's what we agreed as in our proposal. We think it's a good idea for a neighbor to support that, and here's why. That's a public hearing. It's downtown City Hall. It's all the normal sort of public hearing kind of stuff. And then that is the time period where from that point afterwards, so everything after that 2nd or 9th date, we pretty much have to stay with that proposal. We, the city, have to stay with that proposal because we can't modify it after that date in the city council part of the process. We're not allowed to do that without running afoul of other requirements we have. So up until that time period, we can continue to, as much as everybody else that agrees and has the time, can continue to come up with solutions and compromises and consensus and what have you. Yeah, I think we'll go here first.
I have a question. I was hoping we could talk about some of the specifics of the code today, but I guess maybe we don't have time for that. But I did have a question about how it applies to my zone.
Sure.
I know you've got this thing called the lot compatibility zone, which is the first 60 feet or half of the lot, which applies to zones 1, 2, and 6, but I noticed that it does not seem to have been applied to zone 4.
Yeah.
Which means, as a practical matter, that rather than maintaining just the front part of my house, I have to maintain all of my house, including the back, including all of it, in its historical form, which seems unfair to me.
Okay. Because you're in sub-area 4, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yeah, that's currently
More. So I'm
Good point.
wondering if there's some way to address that.
There could be. There could be.
I can see why there might be a difference between the zones, because you've got structures like the church, for example.
Yeah,
But
that's a good point.
But it seems like there would be a way to carve out something for with a residential permit.
Do you want to move back, Bill, into some? Just kidding.
But I think that, it's a good point. It's a good question, which is you're looking at the overall pattern of the neighborhood versus the individuality of the lots. We need to see if there's a way to eliminate some of those potential conflicts. Good point. There's someone else. Oh, it was you.
I understand the restrictions we have here, sort of. We're in the process of doing some really good groundbreaking discussions here. I would like for the city to consider, since we are trying to carve out new regulations, give us a little bit more time, just to have these discussions. Because I think it's going to be beneficial to the whole overall process for us as a neighborhood and for the city and what you were trying to accomplish. That's my personal belief.
Another question at the time on, there's 2 rows that have conflicting dots. Are these just?
You mean where they overlap?
Yeah, they overlap. Are they like double booked days or?
No, that's a good question. So what it means is that the one where they do the first overlap, which is between the asterisk and the circle, I guess it is, which is the PHNA general meeting presentation and vote is how it's described here. That's a PHNA meeting, but it ties into the MPU process because that recommendation goes to the MPU. That's why there's
it's not the MPU meeting.
No, and then the other overlap, which is between the diamond and the circle, which is the zoning review board meeting, that public hearing downtown I described. That's because the MPU process feeds into that, then it goes from that onto the legislative process. That's where you have
like a flow chart.
Yeah. So they'd be like double arrows there, I guess, in the flow chart.
I'm not saying or suggesting months here. And I don't think giving, months to the process is beneficial in the long run. But this is not your ordinary, what you're used to historic district.
Point taken. Point noted.
Just my personal.
I understand. One thing I'll say really quickly that is not on here, and just so folks don't, freak out because they talk to their neighbors, I'm sure, is that we are required by city code to send the proposal to adjacent MPUs because they're within a certain distance of this neighborhood. They are not voting up or down on the proposal whatsoever. We do it for information purposes only. But I will be attending those MPUs in case there are questions that get asked. There'll be MPU F, which of course is across Ponce, and then MPU N, which would be south and east, I guess, up here, south and west up here. So if you were to see, if you love looking at MPU agendas that aren't your own or going to other meetings, you will see those come up. And you might even see me at those meetings. I go to MPU F anyway, so that's my home MPU as far as my staffing responsibilities. So those are not on here. Yeah. So that's something that we don't have on here. And the last thing I'll say real quick about process is you'll note at the very end, which you probably can't read it, but I'll say it to you anyways. And so ultimately the city council, as I said before, has to adopt the proposals, legislation, just like democracy, you've got to adopt it, and the mayor has to sign it into law. If that all occurs, the mayor signs it into law, then we were required to send out additional notices to everybody who was in the district, give them the final package of the map, final package of the requirements, whatever the final adopted thing was. And so you would get that sort of to close out the process with the city, so to speak, as far as, like this designation process. And the other thing that will happen, which is also sort of on the back side, if you will, is we also file a notice with the Fulton County Real Estate Records Office, so that if someone does a title search in the future, they'll notice will come up, they'll say, you're in this special district, please call the city of Atlanta, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And that's also then that we file on behalf of the initiative. And that's required by the city code too. I'm sorry, I think we had the game started.
Could you help me make sure I understand correctly? Right now, we're covered by the city code, Atlanta City Code.
Mm-hmm.
That Atlanta City Code can be altered, changed if the city decides to do that.
Or if the neighborhood decides to do it, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. It's a law.
At this point, the city could come in and say, citywide, we're going to change the code to do this.
They could.
And the city
But
does.
if we go and decide that we want to have one of these historic districts, and we, as the neighborhood, define that, and it becomes law, can the city come in and say, no, we're going to change that?
Yes, they could. I'll tell you that it hasn't happened yet in my experience without the neighborhood's engagement and actually asking for that in the 23 years I worked in the city of Atlanta. But it's a law.
It's a law, but the
just like
city
any law.
could conceivably come back and make a change to say, you know what, we're now going to make all of the side parameters 6 feet instead of 7.
That is technically possible, yes.
Even without us voting on it, or?
Well, it'll still be rezoning, so it'll still go back to the MPU process. But yes, I mean, it's like any other piece of legislation in the city of Atlanta.
But it's less likely than like the way the city's doing the zoning update now, that just happens.
It's less likely, but it is possible. I have to make that clear as we fortify. I think that question is that.
Regarding the time, from my impression, it seems like we are so close to the end, and that Caleb has, 95% of what he needs to really get us where we're trying to go? Just wanted to, am I correct in that?
So the time part is with our current, the schedule we have now, it's not on here, it wasn't there at one point, we have till, I believe, the 23rd of May to have a resolution to the proposed legislation and do our notices and stuff after the fact. That's the time period we have. And then to the 95% part, that's what when he showed the last time he was here. I think what he's trying to say is that we have a lot of things figured out. I mean, the percentage, I don't know. I mean, I can't argue on the percentage, but that a lot of the meat of the matter, there's at least a proposal out there to be considered. I mean, obviously, you might not agree with it, which means you might not think the 90% is accurate, but I think his point was that we have a proposal that's 95% possible to be done. The question is, if people like that or not.
And for the, I know we vote on March 18th. What is the last point where we have, as far as dates go, to continue refining what our wishes are?
The day before the zoning report meeting.
Which is, so we could continue working with you and Caleb if there are things that we feel we need to work out.
Yes, that's possible.
Okay,
But
thank you.
the neighborhood vote would be before that. It would be, and that's, the folks who run the neighborhood association can speak to that scenario. It's supposed to get it for the 18th, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
It's good, that's when the general meeting is, we can move those, we have the flexibility to do that.
Okay, there you go.
This is on the March NPU docket, so.
It's like a week later, right?
Right, it's the fourth Thursday in March,
Yep.
so really, that's our deadline
So we have to have the
We have
neighborhood
to
meeting
have-
before that meeting.
prior to that.
You might have the room of like a week if you want to push it to the envelope of what I did.
Now, the survey, I mean, let's just, I know it's not 5%, it could be 5.7, 7, whatever. But the survey, the last survey that the board has been working on,
Yes.
that really covers the last 5% and all the questions that have really surfaced up. It's like the third survey we've done this year.
If I were to describe it, and I can describe it as I understand it, just to put this in my understanding, the draft form of the regs was sort of created as a mechanism to try to understand what you knew and didn't know. That's kind of that was a way of saying what happened when I surveyed, because you can't fill them out if you don't know something, or if you can't make some reasonable assumption. So we haven't audited that to be able to say like what is in there that we could still choose that hasn't really been asked. At some point you had to get something done, and so it got to that point. And we have those now, and you have kind of the format that Lisa's working on, where this is kind of a Cliff Notes version of it. I just think it's a slightly different name, but we're taking that and to compare that to understand what is in there and what is not in there, and that would be the last piece that we could think of to ask, is to make sure that every input you guys can have, it's a reasonable input, not just a silly one. You've expressed what you want. It feels like it's pretty close, to be honest, but and the current survey, he's working on it. I mean, I think it's nearly done.
Yeah,
Let me ask
we
you a
should have
question.
it out by the weekend for sure. I mean, it's already gone back and forth with everybody. There's an email chain of like 58 emails that I'm working through to just go and put everyone's edit in.
Well,
So-
let me ask you then, this is gonna come out at some point, like Monday, let's say. Then you're giving people, respondees, a certain amount of time.
We'll have to give them a week.
And then you collect the information. Caleb then has to redraft. Redraft has to go back out to the neighborhood to look at. How much time frame are we talking about, and can we meet that day? Knowing what you know.
It feels tight, like I've said this all along. I mean, it's like every day is a footprint. I mean, literally, I just run as fast as I can run to try to get it done. And,
But we think we can do it, and if we can, then let's do it. And
Try.
For me, I'd like to see contemporary architecture in the neighborhood. They don't. I'm willing to give up on that and get it off the table if it's going to be a continued
I think it's
issue.
already in the, I mean, I think
It's in the survey.
You're in the survey. I mean, I would be shocked if it doesn't get
Okay.
on people's tables, whether it's
Then let me-
Friday or Saturday, that you're gonna have it. So people, I'd like to give it to people so they can do it over the weekend. And I think, if people are engaged, you'll get more feedback faster.
Well,
Can
clearly,
we commit to a minimum amount of time that residents and interested parties have to fill out the survey? Because I know consistently it's tough and everyone has day jobs and putting this together.
Yeah.
But making sure that folks have time to look this over and fill it out, and that we're reaching as many people as possible with the survey while still honoring this time.
So we covered visual images that are actually in the survey tonight. That was part of the benefit of this. This is recorded, people get to see that. They can go back and look at the past PowerPoint to go review if they've got questions on top of that. I think it's probably the most documented thing they've ever done. They don't have to fill out the survey multiple times. This time it's just one survey covers all 7 sub areas. I think it's a really great design from what I can tell, right? So I think people will be able to just do it, and they'll know that they're talking about, the image they look at is about a house, or if the question's about commercial or retail, the images tie back into that, so it's an easier process to do that if you're gonna do it just one time. So I think you'll get it, and then the question is when he gets it, is you give it to Caleb and you go like, what's missing, right? We're gonna, meanwhile, we're still gonna do our work to find out what we think hasn't been asked. So we can go, these are very simple questions. Is it 3 feet or 5 feet? It's not complicated. Is it 5 feet or 7 feet? They're hard numbers as a parameter in there. So we'll go through all those as a separate thing and be ready. We won't be waiting on him, and it doesn't require imagery, I don't think, for the most part, to do that. The more complicated things are things like lot compatibility stuff, and understanding that, and understanding what is compatible, right? And we're gonna work on that in the meantime, whether we have meetings or not because we won't have them, but we'll work with Doug and Caleb to try to put together answers to be able to communicate that to people, because we want people to understand, really understand what they're choosing.
But even so, if we get to the end and we start implementing this, and we find that there's some tweaks that need to be made, we can still make them in another
Not every
year.
ordinance. Do you go back through don't you go back through the entire legal process to make a change to it?
Sure, great question. So the question was, if I have it correctly, was that, so if the district gets created, it has a set of rules that go along with it, which is part of the process, of course. They get enacted on such and such a day, and we use them for a while. And then either because that's not, we have a concern about how it's coming out, or they were not concerned about it, or whatever it is, we can amend the historic district requirements. We've actually done that many times around the city of Atlanta. And it goes back through a rezoning process. It does not go back to the designation process. But there's usually a series of community meetings, there's a public hearing, and so on and so forth. But it's not like the creation from scratch. But it's an open public process to make it tap.
Is it like the process of a variance? Is it like this? Would you correlate that?
It's more like a rezoning proposal. And so it goes to the same board that actually would consider this, the zoning review board, and it's a legislative process, which is, the BZA is not a legislative process, to simplify it a little bit.
You're zoning a piece of property.
Yeah. And it's technically called a text amendment, if you really want to
So I say let's go with what we can get done and agree on, and let's get this done. I'll change my opinion.
We made it this far.
There's a question, I think, and then we'll see you.
So we're saying that we are hopeful that we will come to agreement and hope that a majority of people want to do this change. We set up new guidelines, and if we find out a year or two from now that we want to change those guidelines, we can make alterations to those guidelines. But we still have the ability to ask for a waiver to anything, correct?
All the requirements in the city have variance, it's called a variance request, yes.
So, there's still nothing set in stone that you can or cannot do until you've asked for a waiver to variance.
True, but we want to, the idea is you want to set up a set of requirements that are, and then the variances are based on a hardship condition.
Only?
All the variances in the city of Atlanta are based on hardship.
That can't be true, because there's a house across the street from me that went from one side of the lot to the other side of the lot because they got a variance to put extensions on both sides of the house. There's no hardship that they needed to do that, but they got those variances.
I'd be happy to look up that case and figure out what the hardship is about. I mean, I can't speak to other variances issues.
They got 3 stories, and they got the house 50 feet wide on a 50-foot lot.
Yeah.
That's a hardship for the rest of us.
I would agree.
I was wondering, I think, is it Bill? So with his concern that the rules for his house are different from other zones, how can we reassure him that that's going to be addressed in this month period?
What is the best way for me to address that? Do I need to contact Caleb about that?
I would rather you guys send us questions, let us organize all of it and send it as, these are the questions. And because the other thing is it allows it to be a Q&A for everybody to learn from it.
So he's been having issues all along, and
Yours
we
is
need to
yours.
help him resolve this.
Yeah, your current Q&As, are they all on the website? If,
I'm sorry?
if he asks a question, would the answer be posted on the website?
We can set up a Q&A so there's actually like a living document that can be done.
There is a Q&A on the website, but I don't
So you're-
currently have access to
Are you
it.
speaking about like
I don't
a,
Say,
think it's being
anything, I'm not saying, like, I don't know what new questions people have based on the rough drafts or whatnot, but we can organize that where it's like a Q&A, so it allows people to have a growing living thing.
It's just like for Bill, he has a really valid concern, and if it's getting stymied because it's having to go through two people who have a lot going on.
I'm not stymieing Bill at all. If he wants to go talk to Doug, he can. I mean, I can't stop him from talking to Doug. I'm just trying to find a way that, I think maybe his situation is unique. I was just saying that collectively, people have questions about whatever it is, compatibility, whatever it is, that can end up being a thing that's a living thing. If you want to go process Doug, you can.
What is the most efficient way that on this timeline we can submit questions and make sure that we're getting consensus of the neighborhood, especially for stakeholders in certain sub-areas? And is that going to require more volunteers maybe, or opening up access to other board members?
The question is not one that I can answer right now, but I can say that what I'm trying to offer to you is a way to organize that information where it's an ongoing living structure, right? So that's not that it has to be done that way, it's just that it's an ad lib. I'm sitting here saying people are asking questions, what are they? You know, we have all these meetings, we let people come here to ask their individual questions. I don't know how many more meetings Doug will agree to come and have those questions, but there's certainly a mechanism to do that, right? That's what the purpose of them are. And then you have these, you write the proposals and you have a rough draft, and you can read through all those things, and then if those things generate questions, you go, that's either something you're gonna wanna talk about to a group of people to say, hey, what do you guys all feel about this? If just you do it, then it can't be asked to anybody else. If the answer is, hey, we're trying to generate a question that generates more survey questions because you want your whole neighborhood to go, yeah, I'd like to support that, or just do more. You know what I'm saying? So that's part of the reason is by getting that, it allows you to ask that question to everybody. Put it to everybody.
Let's look at the forest here and not look at individual tree.
I'm not talking about individual, I'm saying that that's what the
So,
benefit of it.
there are certain hardship issues that we need to address for our friends. And Bill's one of them. Babette's was one of them. Those kinds of things that don't seem to fit quite right. But I wouldn't go through another several rounds of surveying because we don't have time. Let's get this survey out and do the best we can. That's what I'd like to suggest.
Well, we're trying to do that.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, let's all focus on the end.
we're trying to do it.
so, it's 9:30.
Yes.
I'm gonna wrap up my part. This is my second meeting tonight for community meeting, so I'm ready to hit the road. So, thank y'all for coming. You know how to get in touch with me. We're gonna get some sort of thing that folks will consider by the time we need to consider by. And I really appreciate everybody's engagement. You all don't have to be here, and I know that, so thank you for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Doug.
Yes, thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much.
That's great.